It's June 23rd. It's been over a month since we installed the monitoring system in the drainage field, and we'd like to show you some results. I'm talking with David and Andy Oliver, who own this piece of ground, and Jeff Lanham, who is Extension County and Weakley County. I have three things I'd like to really be able to communicate through this session. I'd like to help to understand what you're seeing when we look at the sensor data. Show how we may be benefiting from having control of the water table to bring more water to the crop during dry periods. And then I'd like to kind of evaluate how we're performing for the main task of the drainage system. How are we draining? How are we removing water? Are we doing a good job there? So we'll get started. And this is inside the Zentra Cloud system. And we're looking at the matrix potential sensors. They are what measures soil moisture, but more really soil tension, how hard it is for the soil to pull water away from, or the plants to pull water away from the soil. And we have three sensors, we have a sensor at 6 inches, that's the blue. The darker green would be 18 inches, and the lighter green would be at 30 inches. And it really, in this month-long snapshot we have of the data since the end of May, we kind of see all the conditions maybe that are important. Back in this range, all the sensors are in what could be saturated range. And that was true for most of May. Sensors are indicating we could be pretty wet out there still. That would be from like 9 to 11 centibars of tension. And then we really, with the water table, we really don't drain to field capacity in the presence of a water table. But if we didn't have a water table, that's one key point to look at. It's the point where water no longer naturally would drain out of the soil if it was free draining. And here's a quick snapshot back in mid-June, where it kind of shows we're near 20 centibars. So the top sensor is a little past field capacity, and the middle sensor hasn't quite reached that. So that's the point where if you didn't have this water table present, we'd expect water to drain to that point. And then some other key points would be maybe over here, when we're looking for irrigation trigger points, if we had an irrigation system. If you were in a crop growth stage that was more sensitive, reproductive growth stage, and you guys might have reached that now, when you start dropping below 100 or 70 or in that range, so we have two here, just a couple days ago before a rainfall event that were at 150. That would say in that area, water's getting a little hard for the crop to use, but you still have one that's just pretty close to field capacity. So there's a lot of easily available water in the deepest depth, but here at the two shallower depths, it's not like a crop's going to show severe stress at this point. It just means that if all the sensors were in that level, you'd start to lose some yield. You still could have a good yield from this crop if everything stayed at 150 centibars, but we expect if you could keep it a little higher than that, you'd do a little better. So that's a quick look at the range of what the sensors are telling us. Another sensor we have is the rain gauge, and this becomes a little hard to look at, easily pick up the numbers because it's in 15-minute increments. And so you'd have to add up, we have 3 events in the last month period, rain events, and if you added them all up, this is a little over 7/10 of an inch. This one's about 1.1 inches, and this is not quite 4/10 of an inch down here. So that's the 3 events we had, but you'd have to go in individually. Each bar, that's 1,500. That's 1,500. You have to add up all the bars to get how much that event was. Like I said, this was about 1.1. And then there's other things to look at, but one of the last key things to look at would be the water table level. Now, when you look at this, you have to think of it, when it says 40 inches, that means there's 40 inches above the sensor, which is at 60 inches. So really at this point in time, this highest point, the water table is only 20 inches from the ground surface. So it's fairly high. And that correlates to that one rain event we saw earlier, had brought the water table up. And it drops over time. There's a little rain event, bumps it up some more. and then our low is at about 4 inches. So right now, the water table is sitting at about 56 inches below the ground surface. So one of the things I was looking for was thinking, you know, this line should become less steep as the water table drops, because there's less head of water to drive water into the drains. And when it passes drains, I was expecting to see this flatten out. And I'm thinking our drains are somewhere in this range of about 24 to 30 inches. But I never saw that. In fact, as we go deeper, as the water table falls to 40 inches and below, the line becomes steeper. And so my only explanation at this point would be that might be because the corn has really grown, it's pulling a lot of water, and it's helping to drop the water table. We finally do see an inflection point where it slows down here and goes more flat, but it's pretty deep at this point. The water table is 54 inches from the surface. So that's something to think about. Is that where we've gone past the natural drainage depths of the drainage ditches and the creek that's beside it? It'd be good to know if water was flowing out there still or not. But maybe it's more we're hitting a point more of equilibrium where the water table's stabilizing because water's coming in from other areas. Because we've had this drainage system there, we've pulled water, we've got a better stand, we've got better crop canopy and better root development, and now and we've pulled the water table down further than some of the surrounding areas, and possibly water's feeding back in to this area because the water table is a little lower and helping to supply the crop. And that is one way that controlling the water table and stabilizing it somewhere can help to bring water to a crop even in a dry period. So we might get to see that a little better if it stays dry longer. If this water table stabilizes and the soil moisture stabilizes, we can come to more of a conclusion that the water table is helping feed the crop the water it needs from surrounding areas. And I've seen this happen in desert regions, so I know it does happen, and it probably happens here. We just have to see if we can figure out when and if it's happening for us. One thing we did was we did verify back here on, I believe it was June 5th, that there was no water coming out of the drains. So we do know already at 40 inches, we're below the drains. The drains aren't contributing any water being pulled out of the soil profile at this time. So somewhere back here, we're expecting the drains stop flowing. We're probably at 30 inches of depth, or maybe 24 or 30. Maybe it's a little deeper there because we're close to the outlet. So again, one way a water table could help us is it can feed water back in. Water can flow from surrounding areas to the water table and then be drawn up into the crop roots from this location. And I've seen it in other soils and other situations where a water table this deep has supplied quite a bit of the water to a crop. So that's one way. Another way, I'm going to go back up here to soil moisture a little bit, that a water table that's controlled enough to give us oxygen, but also it can help us store water. So here's a time period of about 10 days up to a rain event. And if you look at the moisture readings, say here, you can see that 10 days after the last rain event, the top is dried out at 102 centibars, but if you look down, we haven't even reached field capacity yet. If this was a free draining soil, those lower two sensors should be at 20 or maybe lower, because water's been coming out from crop water use. And so actually the presence of a water table helps us store water, more water than a free draining soil could. But again, we've got to have enough oxygen in to make this whole thing work. So it's kind of a balancing act. So those are the two ways that either water coming up from the water table, that they drain, a water table that's controlled can help us provide water to the crop, and it actually stores more water in the soil above the water table than you would in a free draining soil. So we actually have a benefit of extra water sometimes in the presence of a water table, but we need to control it and get enough water out for oxygen to be there. And that's the last thing I was going to look at a little bit. Well, how well are we draining? And maybe I'm going to jump back and forth a little bit here between some of the slides. at this point, we had a rain event. So it wasn't very big, but it did bring the soil moisture back up in the top sensor, but it never penetrated to the second level at 18 inches. And therefore, if we go back down, that rain event never bumped the water table because no water ever reached it. And then, if you look at this rain event, only the top was really dried out some, and it was a bigger event, 1.1 inches. It actually bumped this back up to saturation and actually took the second one to saturation. The third level was already at saturation, so enough water reached the water table that it brought it back up 3 inches. And then finally, if we go back in time to this rain event of about not quite 3/4 of an inch, the sensors before that, the two lower sensors are still at saturation, and it had just barely started to dry out. And this, say, 3/4 of an inch of water went right to the water table. Whoops, I didn't go far enough. It went right to the water table and bumped it up about 10 inches. And prior to this, there was a 6/10 inch. Oh, this was the 6/10. The one prior to it was 7/10. Prior to it, everything was indicating it could still be saturated, and we bumped up the water table 15 inches, but it's off because it's past a month. I can't see it on this screen. So in some ways, as I look at this, I'd say we know that the drainage is doing you guys a lot of good, and yet it makes me wonder a little bit about if the drains would be deeper and pulling water out a little sooner and a little earlier in the growing season, if it would be worth that extra effort, because the water, even through most of May, the water table or the soil moisture is staying pretty close to saturation according to the sensors. But we know we're doing good because you're able to get in and the crop's growing better than it ever has, but a little deeper may be better. I mean, one thing that maybe, I don't know if you've thought about this, but you think about something that's a little more than a ½ inch of water. That's less than the tip of your finger in a depth of water. Why it would raise the water table, say 10 or 15 inches like it did back in May. And I can do a back calculation. When I did that first event in May, rain event, actually, if you do a back calculation, it says there's only 3% oxygen in the soil. There was no room to store water anyplace else, so it went right to the water table and raised it. And then when it was a little drier here in this event, there was 6% oxygen in the soil because it was just a little drier, and it raised the water table 10 inches with just a very small amount of water. So I guess that's just a little thing to consider for the future. It's not something you can do much about now. We're still hunting for that point where we might get some more benefit out of turning up the drain outlets so we don't let any more water out. It seemed like we went a little past that point this time, but that's something we'll be searching for. And really, it's kind of ended up being kind of a formal presentation. But if you guys have some things you're curious about, I don't really have any more to say.
So if we had access to this type of information, we would have a better idea of knowing when to turn the pipe up and stop the draining process.
Yeah, I mean, in the original proposal to do this, we wanted to monitor outflow so we'd know that at the same time, but we didn't get enough money to do that. So it's just kind of hit or miss a little bit. We can go out and see when it stops flowing and maybe catch it when it's not just about stopped, and we'll get an idea what the water table is, and we can learn from that. You're right. It's a tool where we can learn when we might want to turn that up. And maybe there's times where you turn it up and then you get an unexpected big event and you want to turn it right back down. I mean, you'll see that too. You'll see the water table jump way up. So yeah, that's a tool that'll help us manage in time for helping to maintain water there for dry periods, not just drainage, which we're getting a lot of benefit from now, but just to try to make sure we're optimizing the other side of that, keeping water there when we need it.
If the water table now is like 54 inches in that bottom, what would be a best guess the water table on a hill field?
I didn't quite catch the last part of that.
What would be best guess the water table on a hill field?
On the hill above where the drainage is?
Yes.
You know, if it's not perched on a fragipan, you shouldn't actually, I don't know where it would be, but you shouldn't find it within 5 feet. I do see on hillsides, especially early in the season, May and the beginning of June, if there's a fragipan, sometimes a perched water table, it's not the water table that's connected to groundwater necessarily, it's perched above that fragipan. I've seen those as high as 20 inches. So sometimes the water does sit in the hillside too. But right now, after your crops are pretty big, they're drawing out water, it hasn't rained for a while, I wouldn't expect that water table to be very close across the road from this drainage system.
It's really interesting to us to see things we've only always just kind of wondered about, how that was. It's good to kind of know. It is.
Yeah, you know, if you finally saw this last one go below, say, 100 or so, and they're all below there, that might be an indication that irrigation is needed. It's still possible that water could be coming up from the water table even at that point to help your crop. But without the presence of a water table, that would be an indication it's time to irrigate. I think, you know, drainage systems have been used to put water back in the field, but that's sometimes kind of difficult if it's not real flat. I mean, you have your drainage system's on a slope, so it's hard to back water up to get it into the entire field, but people have used drainage systems that way. If we had individual control on each lateral coming into the main drain pipe that empties into the ditch, then it might be a little easier to back up water into each pipe. So, and there are people who do both. I'm not recommending it. They will use drainage and irrigation when needed. So, but it'll be interesting to see, you know, in fields that have better drainage. I have that top sensor way drier than this already. So, I would say the water table has retained some water for you here by not, you know, it's helped you to get it down so your crop can grow, but now having it semi-close is helping you out.
Yes, it'll be very interesting to see if we can look up and get a big rain in the next week or two to see what that might change, getting this late in the summer
Season. Yeah, and I need Jeff to check his rain gauge beside the road a little bit, because when I look at this one here, this is like not even 4/10 of an inch of water. I guess I wouldn't quite have expected it to brought that top sensor back up as far as it did. I'm kind of wondering if the corn crop hasn't grown back over the canopy. The canopy's gone over the rain gauge again, is deflecting some water there or something. But I don't know if anybody wants to volunteer to crawl in there and open it up a little bit again. It's not a fun job.
I opened up a pretty good area. I kind of looked at what the size of the plants might be later in the growing season when they started tossing, that kind of stuff. So I've got it opened up around there pretty good. And David checks that rain gauge every time we get a rain event, and the 4/10 amount is pretty close to what we're catching in the
And maybe it has penetrated 6 inches and refilled just down to 6 inches and hasn't gone any further or something like that. It surely hasn't hit the 18-inch sensor. Something else that can happen, which will improve over time, is, you know, we put in the sensors a month or so ago, and maybe we didn't repack the soil well, and maybe that's kind of collapsed and made a little divot there, and so water can pond in there or something too. So. But with time, as soil moves around, should fill that back in if that's one of the reasons. I just wasn't quite expecting that much water to penetrate that far, but it's possible.
I don't know what kind of rain y'all got, David, but it fell really good at home. You know, like it would have soaked in. It wasn't a rain where you'd had a lot of runoff. It would have soaked in.
It felt good. Yeah, that's true.
There's some other stuff on here that, you know, could be of interest. If you've looked at the soil temperatures at the different depths, of course, the top is warmer and it varies. This blue line goes up and down with day to night because it can be affected by the air temperature. It's close enough to the surface. The others are more stable, but are lower. And then if you look at the water temperature on down further, it's actually usually the lowest temperature. So it's still, whoops, did I miss it? Yeah, there it is. Water, it's still in the 60s where all the soil temperatures are in the 70s. So that's one thing we could do, especially I'd like to monitor this system in the winter too. After you harvest, put everything back out, because right now we're watching stuff with water coming out from the plant and from drainage. But in the winter time, if we get some dry periods, it'd be good to watch just drainage by itself to see if the behavior is a lot different than when there's a crop there. And the other thing we could do with the temperatures, if it helps you plant, I mean, there's more ports left open on that data logger. We could put just a temperature sensor, say at 2 or 3 inches, so you know what the temperature is right where you want to plant. So it gives you a better idea when it's appropriate to plant. So that's another.
It's pretty interesting with the temperatures as the corn gets bigger and shades the ground more, soil temperature has dropped.
Yes, it has. Yeah. So you're right.
Yeah.
So yeah, when that sun's beating on that darker colored ground, it's warming it up more.
Pretty, there's way over 80 there one time.
Yeah, and
Less than 75 now every day.
and as the corn has gotten bigger and the temperature has gotten hotter, air temperature,
Yeah.
it's kept the
It's still
soil
cool.
cooler.
It's still cool, I think, yeah.
That's a good observation.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting.
I don't know that this is very useful, but there's also electrical conductivity of the water. And so I think what it really, as it goes up, I mean, electrical conductivity can be, and this is down at 60 inches, and you can get sensors that in the soil profile that'll look at this too, electrical conductivity. The ones I have don't. You know, it could be an indication of fertilizers being salts, but I think this is more an indication that the water is leaving the water table to go up into the root zone. And so the salts that are there, and this isn't a very high salt level at all, it's pretty low, are being concentrated by that. As you use water out of a source, you leave the salts behind. So I think, and I think earlier on, well, here's a rain event. So you put fresh water in and the salt concentration drops again. I think that first rain event we had showed a pretty bigger drop in the salt. Again, it dilutes the salts because the rain is distilled water. I'm not sure if that's helpful to watch, but it's there. I thought I'd point it out to you. I mean, we need to watch the battery a little bit as the canopy possibly gets up to the solar panel. It could shade it, but it seems to be dropping a little bit as the canopies. The voltage has dropped a bit, but it's still pretty good. It's down a little bit now, but maybe that's the cloud cover more than the crop canopy. So there's something to watch. The other thing I was thinking about is, do you need help getting around the software? Is it something that you understand? I mostly just we can set up some charts with this one to look exactly like you want them, and they stay stable. The numbers don't move as the data changes. You'd hit that, but there's nothing there right now. You can make your own graph custom to what you want to see. I did that some last year. I haven't done it. This one lets you pick. We've been looking at the detail version. So I have it set at a month right now, but you can look. Well, my data's being a little slow here. There, we're back to what we were looking at before, but you can change that a little bit. You can go just a week if you want to zoom in on a little more. And just see the last week. So we've had all this drying in the sensors. We had the rain event. The top sensor's gone up. It just kind of magnifies. Makes it a little easier sometimes to count these bars if that's how you want to get to rainfall off that rain gauge. Once you make this a little smaller scale. I mean, a lot of this inventory and stuff like that, I think it's just if you want to, you only have one logger out there, just want to work with some of that stuff. There's a map view, which really just shows you where we're at in the field and shows you some data about it. You know, a lot of this is, I mean, I keep track of a lot more things, you know, other people's farms and research stations, but you only have one location right now, so you wouldn't be using that. Let's go back to detail. Some of this is how I got you on as users. This one down here. There's a sidebar. All right. So I just called it plot. I didn't. So I have right now, it's Oliver Farm. It's in Weakley County. I just called it plot, and it's the drainage monitor. But I can change this to reflect the field. See, tell me if I spell this right.
That's it.
And then just accept that. It should change eventually. There it is. So now, if you had more fields with this system on, you'd be able to identify by field. And if we had another monitoring system higher up in the drainage system, not as close to the outlet, we could call it drainage outlet and drainage upper or something like that, so you could identify it, things like that. So that's more identification things. You know, I haven't done this much, but I think you can set alarms. If something reaches a certain point, you can have it send you an email with this alarm button.
Well, that might be pretty good if you got too much water, or
You tell you turn a pipe
or
down.
tell you when to turn it up.
Yeah, you turn a pipe down. Yeah. They've been up a while, haven't
Yeah, we just a month roughly.
Yeah, I still think when we get a standard established, it should be immediately.
We always wait too long.
Yeah, we always make too long.
And,
So yeah,
but we're wet, or we're discussing here, we always wait too late to turn the pipe up. But it's the past few springs, it's been really wet and really cold. And we get it planted, but we're scared to death we're gonna get a big rain event. So we let it keep draining. If you had an alarm set to tell you about when to turn it up, that would at least help some. You know you'd drain at a particular level, and it alert you it'd be close to time to turn it back up.
and you could alert it if the water table jumped up higher again than you wanted it to. It could alert you both
Right.
directions. Yeah.
Right.
Sure. I mean, yeah, we're kind of in a passive mode right now. There's not much to do but watch. But I think, yeah, as we get some winter data and we get some another growing season, I think, you know, some patterns will be more confirmed in our minds of what's happening and help us make some better decisions. And I don't know how we investigate easily, you know, what a deeper drain depth would do. I know that in Colorado with sandy soils, even the drain depths were deeper than we've been putting them in Tennessee. But some of that has to do with salinity. Like I saw that EC growing. If you do that in a desert environment, have the water table too close, it brings water right to the surface and causes you salt and salinity problems. And so they're deeper. And then a lot of the work textbooks that I've looked at or had classes in for drainage were done in the Netherlands with heavy soils and muck. And again, there's a lot more small pores. And so you got to drop the water table quite a bit more. So you have air in the soil. You know, you get a lot more air in the soil with sand because it's holding water maybe at 20% and has 30% air in it when it's at field capacity, and a clay could be at 40% with only 10% air at field capacity. So, so in these silt loams, like I said, it's a little hard. It's like I'm looking at like 20 some days of pretty wet conditions through May and right to the beginning of June, and yet the crop has performed better than you would have expected it without the drainage system. And so is it worth the extra effort of getting drains deeper to get more of an effect through, say, May and getting the crop maybe even established quicker and getting the roots developed faster and then stabilizing that water table down further? So it's a question that's kind of hard to answer. If you guys have any ideas about how to do it, I guess if we had a field where they were deeper, we could compare it. And And it's not something you can retrofit very easily at this point in time.
No.
But that's a general important question, I would think, for going forward as people continue to adopt drainage.
Dr. Leib, I know you can spend whatever you want to, and it depends on what system you go with. But if we were to put in a system like this in other fields, you have a ballpark idea of what kind of money we're talking about?
Yeah, so I should know that. I'm trying to think now. Man, my brain's not functioning. I just bought some stuff here. So what are the loggers right now? You know, I think the logger prices come down into the $800, but they put up the yearly subscription. It used to be really cheap. It used to be $75 a year, which was a bargain in anybody, but they put that up to $175 a year to keep a cell phone and to keep the data plan, which is still pretty good. It's better than most, or all that I know of, but the $75 was a bargain. What gets you here with this system more is that water table sensor is about $500 on its own. And those soil moisture sensors are in the $300 range. I have complained about that to the company. I'm saying, to be competitive, I think that's kind of high. But so you can add up 2,000 rain gauge. I just bought one of those, and I thought it used to be a little over 200. Now it was 300. So you can add up $2,000 for a system just like this pretty quick. Now, some of what we might learn is that if you know water table, you pretty much know soil moisture, so you can drop some. And that's what I did in my master's work in Colorado. I kind of said, if you knew the water table, you actually knew the soil moisture. Now it's a little different here. We get more rainfall. That was a desert, but the soil moisture tracked the water table. In other words, it was always pretty constant. If you looked above 20 inches from the water table, most of the time the soil moisture was X. And if you were 30 inches above the water table, the soil moisture was this. And so as the water table dropped from the surface, you actually know what it is on the surface. So do you need a rain gauge? It helps us to know, what happened that caused these changes. But if you're just managing something, maybe you don't need all this, I guess is what I'm saying. If you come to understand the behavior of, maybe the water table is very responsive. Maybe if you just had the water table, you'd know what soil moisture is, when to change the drain. You could see when rain hit the system and caused it to rise, but you wouldn't necessarily know what the rain is. So, but once you put that much money into a logger and a water table sensor, probably $1,200, $1,300, then you'd have to say, well, do I want a rain gauge out there too? So
Kind of never ended.
yeah. And like you said, we could put a temperature sensor on there that's shallower, so it could help you with some other decisions you make. I've run this by some of the more diseased pest people and said, are you measuring something with the same system I am, that I still have ports you could add something else to give you some other predictions about when to spray? So it's better if we could get more use out of one logger by adding some things sometimes. So yeah, I find it's this kind of fascinating thing just to watch how water moves in the soil and how water distributes. And you might not be as fascinated, but it's still hopefully some good information.
It's really interesting. It is.
Yeah, we really don't, if you put one of these systems in the same place, but up higher on the hill and back further away from the outlet where the drains are closer, we might see a lot different response. I don't know how different it is, but again, if soybeans continue to support this, it might be something we look at, or it might be of more interest to you to go to a whole nother field or something like that. But I'm always curious, if you take one measurement, how well does it represent the whole? you know, because this is done at one location. So,
Yes, I have a question.
sure, go for it.
On the screen right there, those figures, like which of those figures, what is the number that would indicate irrigating or needing, you know, the crop is needing water?
So right here, so a lot of times we haven't done as much specific work with corn, but just from other people's work in other locations, a lot of times they'd be triggering it at 70, or a lot of times people like the corn really wet. I don't know that it needs to be that wet. Some people keep it way up here with irrigation. I'm like, I don't think that's necessary, but that's, people really like to see but I'm thinking it's because soybeans are somewhere in here, and corn can be a little more drought, has deeper root resistance, and can do a little better sometimes in soybeans with water. I'm thinking if it's similar to what we've seen in soybeans, you probably could let, again, I think you just need at least one area. Maybe it's not true with corn, but it's been true with soybeans and cotton. If you have one area with easily available moisture, you can let the others fall below this. And actually cotton's is lower than this because it can take more drought. But if all three of them were down here at 150 and you were in, and that's another thing we're finding, we've taken soybeans to like 300 before it gets to the critical growth stages, and then if it was brought back up, they still performed well. I don't know if farmers want to do that, but it just does tell you that growth stages are important. So I would be looking at this if it was a critical growth stage, and I'd say if you had an irrigation system or way to irrigate, if this last one fell below this, that I know you should be irrigating. But most people I watch with corn, they keep things higher than that. And I guess I'm okay with that, because again, this only represents one spot. Other spots of the field could be drier. And sometimes, you know, it's just, I'm also trying to prevent people from keeping them all pegged up here close to field capacity. So when you get a rain, you've gotten too wet conditions and you wasted a bunch of irrigation water. So, so yeah, I think most corn people I watch are really triggering things pretty wet at 50. And you know, even Willie, one I'm watching right now, he's been triggering irrigation well below, before only maybe one sensor's gotten down below 100. But he's not just hammering it. So he's keeping things more in everything has a 60, 40, 30 range. And so he's, again, if you go into a real dry period, he's set up with some reserve soil moisture. He has a little bit of buffer for some rain. I mean, if you got a 4-inch rain, he's not going to capture most of that, but he might still be able to capture up to a 1-inch rain or so in that profile. So I really feel I mean, as scientists or researchers and engineer, I'm always trying to push this as far as we can go to see what will happen. But as a producer, you might not want to push it that far. So you're trying to avoid everything really at 20 or above, because that represents water that's going to drain, or if you get to 10, that's poor, you know, conditions for oxygen in the soil. So you want to let things dry out some, but you don't have to push things as far as I do to see how far you can go. So there is different decisions that I think are valid. There's not just one decision, but I wouldn't expect this field to be losing yield potential yet with the soil moistures where they are. Now you have two with soil moisture that's easily available. I would think that plant has access. You have only the middle one that latest rain didn't penetrate to. So there's some dry soil in there too. So I would think this crop's still in good shape. And again, even if all three were down at 150, it's not a necessarily yield disaster. It's just a point where I'd say you're starting to lose yield potential.